A lot of ransomware attacks these days we see from groups like Netwalker, Revel, and DarkSide. What we are looking at is these attackers exploiting very common loopholes into the systems. For instance, majority of ransomware breaches that have been perpetrated by these ransomware groups is due to the fact that organizations were running legacy and unpatched software. Normally, due to the fact that we have moved to these remote working environments due to COVID, of course, ransomware attackers are targeting employees by the use of business email compromise. For instance, they might send you something like the future of COVID or something that is more related to vaccination. In a lot of cases, they might target something that is related to your company and send you a spear phishing email. So a lot of these ransomware attackers are using macros. And of course, if you are in an organization, chances are that 99% of the time your macros will be enabled. So that is one way into the organization. The other way is by use of remote desktop protocols or VPN protocols. So the attackers are trying to brute force commonly known credentials and they are trying to attack your parameter. That is the most common way that these attackers are using to get inside the network. And once they are inside the network, what they are trying to do is what we call as lateral movement. So lateral movement is when an attacker moves from one system to another system. What they're normally looking for in modern day corporate environment is domain controllers. If you gain access to a domain controller, it would mean that you could push the policies, let's say by using group policy, to all the systems by using, let's say, tools like Mimikatz, and there's like a bunch of techniques like token impersonation and LLM poisoning with tools like Responder. And once attackers gain access to the domain controller, what they do is they try to push their software, which would encrypt all the files on the computer, and then demand payment. Now, a lot of attackers like Revel and DarkSide, they use double extortion schemes. What they do is they exfiltrate the data prior to encrypting it. So one of the primary things that have changed with the ransomware business model is the fact that more and more attackers have started joining ransomware as a service model. So ransomware as a service model is whereby affiliates come in, and of course there is a proper interview, and the people that would work for these groups like Revel, Netwalker are screened through a proper screening process. And once they are a part of that group, they would go and attack the website or the infrastructure of the companies, and they would look for any company that is vulnerable. And then the core developers are the ones that are running the program. They would have a customized build for every single of their victim. And of course, once they compromise the systems, they exfiltrate the data and they give it to the core developers. And then, once the data is encrypted, the core developers are the ones who are going to negotiate the ransom payments. Previously, we had scenarios whereby ransomware operators, just due to their, let's say, incompetence, people from security community were able to decrypt and find the keys. But now, of course, that has changed because as an affiliate, you do not need to develop a ransomware. You do not need to bypass detections. That is something that would be done by the core developers themselves. The other thing is that we are looking at ransomware operators coming up with innovative techniques to blackmail the company. So normally they used to blackmail the company. These days they are also blackmailing the victim. So we saw this recently with a Finnish psychotherapy hack. A company who has gone bankrupt since then. The healthcare record was compromised in 2018 and the company decided to hide that information. But around a couple of years later, the victims were being blackmailed and were being threatened that their data and their medical records would be leaked in case if they don't make the payments. So of course, the fallout was huge. Now, we have also seen scenarios whereby these cybercriminals are threatening the company that they would short on their stocks, because a breach is a negative publicity, and a negative publicity means that your stock, at least in the short run, would go down. Before leaking it on their website, what they are going to do is they are going to tell you that, okay, I'm going to release the data and publicly leak the data of the organization that we have compromised. So what these traders would do is they would put a short bet on the stocks. And of course, any short bet would be definitely picked up by these regulators. We have also looked at scenarios whereby attackers are also threatening companies to do a DDoS attack in case if they don't do payments. But this entire scene whereby you are looking at attackers coming up with more and more innovative ways of extorting money is something that we didn't see last year. We didn't see attackers using zero-day sophisticated exploits to gain access into the systems. And a lot of exploits that they're using are publicly available exploits. They're trying to exploit, let's say, a vulnerable VPN server, or trying to brute force credentials at the parameter. So for instance, they would try to brute force VPN credentials or remote desktop credentials. And of course, due to remote working environments, there's a large possibility that organizations have exposed their servers and have not secured the servers by using things like multi-factor authentication. So as I previously said, it is the companies that are not following best security practices and basic security hygiene, which is why they are being hacked. We didn't see the use of zero-day until recently, when Kaseya managed service provider was compromised by what is known as a supply chain attack. Now, this is something that came months after the SolarWinds supply chain attack was carried out, which was attributed to a nation state. So we are looking at more sophisticated attackers, but it all comes down to companies not being able to follow basic security hygiene. So they're pretty much targeting everyone. So what they're doing is effectively they're scanning the whole internet for vulnerable servers at the parameter level. They are trying to brute force servers. They have got their scripts running around the clock and are using automated attacks to find an entry point into an organization. But they are targeting pretty much every sector, from automobile sector to logistics sector, education sector, and health sector as well. But of course, some records are more important and more valuable than others. For instance, financial records are more valuable than other records. And also health records are very important, because in case if your health records are compromised, it represents the most comprehensive and accurate representation of any individual. One of the recommendations that we give to our customers is to have backups and keep backups of backups. The other thing is that to use multi-factor authentication everywhere. And multi-factor authentication has been a very, very effective control. We suggest our customers a lot of time to use a security monitoring solution, which is well-tuned and which is fine-tuned to block these attacks. Of course, things like red team exercises are very, very important in this regard, as what they do is they simulate the adversary, they simulate the techniques that these ransomware operators or sophisticated cybercriminals are using to gain access to your organization, and that way you are more sure about your defenses. The other thing that we recommend to our customers, which is not very feasible in the real world scenario, is that they should disable macros, because a lot of these spear phishing emails are still using macros to execute malware. Depending upon the organization, we also recommend solutions like EDR, endpoint detection and response, which are very effective in preventing these sorts of attacks. But as I said, this is something that the security community has been telling for a number of years or even decades. Things like, have a strong password, use multi-factor authentication, implement application whitelisting, keep backups. Now, these are not pretty sophisticated controls. These are some things that these are things that any organization can implement.